Well, good afternoon. What fun to be here with all of you listening to these amazing foresters. This is a lot of fun. And it's a real pleasure to get to introduce Mike Dockry. Mike is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and was born and raised in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I'm feeling particularly privileged to introduce him because I did some research into all of the work that he is doing, and I'm really entirely impressed by all of the work that he's leading, and I think you will be too. First, I was asked to give a description of myself and my work, so I'm just going to really briefly tell you a couple of things, starting with the fact that I grew up not too far from right here and was lucky enough to be able to explore the 190-acre urban forest that surrounds us, especially on the weekends. One of the most fun and challenging forestry-related activities I get to do today is help my uncle manage our family's forest land here in Oregon. At EcoTrust, we work to make both people and nature thrive, and my focus, the focus of my work, is on forest restoration and helping landowners make ecological forestry more economically viable. So I'm really excited to hear from Mike. He is working on so many issues that are extremely relevant to the work we're all doing out here in the Pacific Northwest. Mike is a research forester and social scientist with the U.S. Forest Service's Northern Research Station. He is also an adjunct professor in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota in St. Paul. Mike is part of a team of ecological and social scientists working on interdisciplinary research to support foresighted natural resource management decisions. I'm going to say that again. Foresighted natural resource management decisions. This is research that helps us anticipate change, and it's just really cool. Mike might not talk a ton about it, but I'm going to just tell you that he is currently building a strategic foresight research program and is developing three really fascinating and very different projects: a tribal participatory scenario planning for climate change adaptation, an overview of the future of urban forests, and the future of forest-based nanotechnology and the implications for forest resources. The breadth of his research interests includes even more. For example, he is working to help us improve our understanding of the social aspects of forests and natural resource management, sustainability, indigenous community forestry, and environmental history. Mike earned his PhD from the Forest and Wildlife Ecology Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His dissertation explored the environmental histories of an indigenous community in the lowland of Bolivia and the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. He is currently involved in several projects supporting sustainable forest management and climate change adaptation with American Indian communities in the Great Lakes. He is also a leader on tribal issues for the U.S. Forest Service and has helped write national and regional strategic plans for tribal relations. As I mentioned, Mike's expertise overlaps with many of the issues critical to the success of forest management in the Pacific Northwest. Some of these include collaboration, learning from those who have practiced holistic land management for many, many generations, engaging a diversity of people and perspectives, and listening to and respecting this diversity. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce and to listen to Mike Dockry.
Good afternoon, everyone. This has been an exciting set of conversations and talks we've had. I want to thank everyone here for engaging in this discussion. I want to thank the World Forestry Center, the Society of American Foresters, the Hagenstein family members and friends who helped put this on, all of you as the audience. Let's see, Brent for the wonderful introduction. And I'd also like to thank the tribes that have stewarded this land that we're on for many, many generations before us. So I'm not going to talk too much about research. So I do a lot of research, and I love that Brent was able to kind of explore the breadth of what I do, and it makes me feel like I'm a little bit all over the place. And hopefully I can get a little bit deeper here when we talk today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got into forestry, like we've heard before. But before I do that, I wanted to say a little bit about my tribe, the Potawatomi Nation, the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And Potawatomi are from around the Great Lakes area, Lake Michigan. My family members were sort of eastern Lake Michigan, southern Lake Michigan. And I think you might have heard some of the cities around there. Chicago was one of them. Right, so our tribe signed treaties that gave way to Chicago. And like a lot of tribes in the eastern United States, we were forcibly removed. And so this map sort of shows where we were. So this is Lake Michigan here. This is where we kind of start. We were pushed around all the way here, Missouri, Kansas. And then the Citizen Potawatomi later, we moved down to Oklahoma, where our reservation is today. And I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, but my point in bringing this out is that we talk about climate change and the uncertainty around climate change and how are we going to adapt, how are we going to understand this. But we have tribes like mine, and we're not unique in this situation, that have undergone massive climate change. You know, the environment around Lake Michigan is very different from Kansas and Oklahoma, right? But we're still here. We're thriving at this point, and we have a lot of experience. And that gets to my point on diversity that I'll talk about too. That's important to have diverse perspectives in our discussion so we can understand the experience that people have had. So how did I get into forestry? Well, these are my children here. I loved canoeing. When I was little, I loved being outside. My mom tells stories about how I used to go in the backyard and just dig holes. Right? There's a tiny little wood lot in back of our houses, kind of surrounded. We lived in an urban area, but there's a little bit of woods, and my friend and I would go in there and light little fires with the leaves. I was a little bit older than these guys, but I'm sure that they'll try to start fires soon too as well. But I got into it. I was outside, I liked it, and then I started going to summer camp where I learned how to canoe. I got those skills. How can I be on the water? How can I camp? And I really thought that was great. I loved it. That's what I wanted to do. And during high school, I had a biology teacher that knew that I was interested in canoeing and camping, and he said, "Hey, Mike, there's this thing that the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is putting on. There's a camp, and you can go there and get off 2 days of school." And I thought, yes, 2 days of school. That sounds great. Sign me up. And I went there. And I don't remember too much about the camp itself. I remember eating pancakes. I liked that. I liked going to summer camp, so that was kind of cool. But what it did give me was a word. It gave me the word forestry. So that when it came time to go to the university, I had something that I could sign up for, something that would get me outside, something that would help me learn deeper how forests work, right? How forests work. And in that time, in the 1990s, early 1990s, we talked a lot about ecology and people. One of the things, I'll mention oak again, so we have a lot of oak forests, both in Wisconsin as well as in Pennsylvania where I did my master's work. And there was a lot of discussion about fire and the human influence upon fire on the landscape. And the discussion always seemed at that point, at least to me as a young student, to come down to how many Indians were on the landscape, how many people were in the Americas before Europeans settled. And I just remember thinking, this is crazy. How many people do you need to start a big forest fire? Right? I knew that with my little leaves thing. We didn't need that many people. So talking about how many people were on the landscape as a proxy to understand fire's relationship with ourselves and our forests to me was the wrong question. The question that we needed to answer and talk about is how were people involved in managing the landscape? Why do our landscapes look the way they do? And how have people changed through time with that landscape? And so for me, I put this picture up, we were missing the people. I can see that there's no people in here, but I know that there's evidence of people. I can see our lacrosse sticks, our shoes, our life jackets. So I was lacking something in my education there. I wanted, where are the people? Where are the people? And after I got my master's degree, I was getting ready to join the Peace Corps and go down to Bolivia. And that's how I formed connections down there and started doing research there. But I got a job with the Oneida tribe in Wisconsin as a student intern. And this internship was in the environmental planning department. And I learned a new word, planning. Like, wow, this is where people are. This is where I can take my forestry knowledge, my ecology knowledge, and I can put it to use. I can talk to people, tribal members in this case, and understand what they wanted from their natural resources. And I could use the tools that I had learned in school, in forestry school, to make those happen. And it was also cool because I could engage the scientists. So the scientists are always studying really new and interesting things, and I got to bring them to the table to see if what the goals and values that people wanted to put forward, what the managers wanted to do, get to see kind of how's that going to work. So bringing people together to collaborate. And I think we've heard from all of our speakers today that that's an important thing as we move forestry. And I think forestry itself has been changing through time. Let's see with my next slide, yeah. Forestry itself has been changing. I think in the beginning of our profession, and even 30 years ago, foresters, we knew the science, right? We knew answers. We could go into a forest and see what kind of trees were there. We could understand the history of that landscape. We could think about the ecology and how to move it forward. And we sort of knew what we wanted to do. But nowadays, we're shifting our perspective. And you heard that today again. We're starting to see ourselves as servants, right? We have many tools to do all sorts of things in the forest, but we need to work with people to understand what they want and value in the forest, and to then use our tools to get those values. I think forestry can be a game changer in the 21st century. I think forestry can help us solve not only our ecological, but our social and economic problems. A forestry that's a people-centered forestry, with people at the center of what we're doing, that is a vision that I have for forestry in the 21st century. So what are some of our problems that forestry can help solve? Well, we've got problems with the economy. We know that. We've heard about it today. We have rural communities that don't have a lot of job opportunities. We have sawmills that are closing. We have massive inequality in our society. We have incomes that don't help people live productive lives. We've got manufacturing issues, and you hear that on the campaign trail now. Manufacturing is a huge thing. We've lost some of our capacity. Those are the economic problems. We've got social problems. There's a social isolation happening in our country, and people are isolated from one another. Communities are isolated from other communities. Groups are isolated from each other. There's a lack of respect and understanding amongst people. Lack of respect and understanding for difference. There's inequality here too on the social realm. There's health disparities. There's opportunity disparities. Not everyone has the same opportunities in our society. There's educational disparities. We have problems with inclusion and diversity within our institutions and across our society. And then, of course, there's the environmental problems that we have. We have climate change we've talked about. That's a huge one. That's a big issue. Wildfire, we also have talked about that today. Flooding and drought. And these things are all interrelated. And I'm going to tell you a little bit, I'll stop here and go into a little bit of story about invasive species, which is another, on the surface, looks like an environmental problem, but I will argue that it's a deep combination of all these three things. So here is the emerald ash borer. It's a little green bug that came over from Asia in our international trade. So this story starts with the economy at the center. Now this little green bug, have people heard about this? Yeah, I see some people nodding. So it lays an egg, and then the larvae form under the bark and form these galleries, essentially strangling the tree. And this bug is attacking all of our ash trees where they're found. We haven't found ash trees here in North America that are immune to it. So the thought from the ecologists is that this thing is pretty much going to eat through all of our ash trees. So there will be a time where we don't have ash trees or very few left on the landscape. And this kind of gets to the social part. So ash trees grow throughout the eastern United States, from Minnesota over to Maine. And we've been using, as indigenous people, ash trees for many, many things. Here's a Menominee woman in 1914 in a picture showing some of the baskets she made out of ash. Ash is amazing. You can pound on the tree rings and they start peeling apart into these splints that you can use to make baskets. And it's extremely flexible, yet it's strong. So these baskets are not only artistically beautiful, but they're also strong and they're useful items. So there's a combination of art and utility in this, and culture. Some of our tribes out in the east have their origin stories of coming from the ash tree. So they say that their people came from ash trees. And you start thinking of that, and you can't get more profound. These are two Potawatomi basket makers today that make baskets. This was taken at some of the conferences we've held to talk about this issue. What does this invasive species mean to our culture? And you can talk about the environmental aspects of emerald ash borer, but when you really think about if your origin story is being attacked in this manner, this takes it to a whole different level. When we first started having these meetings, this is a very recent thing, this emerald ash borer. I was invited to give talks to Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Forest Service, university people, invasive species biologists. They were working, there's lots of stuff out there that these people are working on, these scientists have in their baskets, so to speak. And when I brought these stories in to tell people this is culturally important, those lacrosse sticks, we use ash for those as well. This is something different. And when the biologists heard that, I could just see a light go off in their eyes. Being, okay, this is something that we need to think about. And I think this is a perfect example of how these social, economic, and environmental issues are interrelated. We can't separate people. All these problems are connected. Our community, our people, the environment. And it's not only enough to look at the science behind these things. We need to see how communities fit into the picture, the problem, as well as the solution. Another problem that we have is that we lack diverse perspectives. As Brent said, I'm really passionate about getting different voices in. I'm passionate about having gender represented in our discussions. I'm passionate about different ethnic groups, age, income, discipline. I think we need diversity of perspectives to really get to the bottom of these problems because they're so large and so interconnected, none of us can do it alone. That's why I think we're seeing this move towards interdisciplinary studies. We're seeing this move towards how do we work science and humanities together. And this is happening in our universities at this point. We really need to find ways to collaborate and bring these perspectives together. And so my plan is, how do we do this? My plan is to put people at the center of forestry. Sometimes we call this community forestry. That's another way to think about it. And when I talk to my students in class, or if I'm giving a guest lecture in the university, I put this definition up on the screen. What is community forestry? Community forestry tries to conserve forest ecosystems at the same time improving and maintaining the well-being of the community. The health of the forest is intimately related to the health of the community. That's community forestry. That's putting people at the center of forest management. And community forestry, oftentimes in the Forest Service, we think about urban forestry, and that's an important part of it, but it's not the only part. So I work with a lot of tribes, and across the United States we have over 560 tribes that are federally recognized. Over 300 of them have significant forest resources, and of those it's about 19 million acres. These are managed as community forests. They might be big across the landscape, some are small, some are big, but they're managed for tribal values. The laws that guide management, the Federal Indian Management Act, Forest Management Act, says that forestry has to provide opportunities for sustainable communities. people-centered forestry. It has to provide multiple benefits, not just sawyers and sawmills, but all the other things that we know forest management provides. Jobs, traditional uses of the land, clean water, carbon sequestration, etc. Here's a map. I think you can kind of see the color splotches here, showing the federal lands and the Indian lands in the United States. The red lands are the Indian lands, and then the other colors are the other federal lands. So here's Wisconsin. The Oneida tribe where I worked as an intern is right there. Menominee is right there. This is sort of the Potawatomi territory here. See how we walked, and our reservation is down there. Here's the same map basically zooming in here on Oregon, and you can see that there's a mixture of lands. And I think we can argue too that, let's step up one too and say all federal forestry should be thought of as community forestry as well. There's lots of land there. We have laws and regulations that say forest management must benefit the people. Then it's incumbent upon us to bring our views into the discussion. I think private land and industry land too can fit into this. We can even broaden our idea of human-centered forestry, communities forestry, people-centered forestry in the industrial lands, because again, we know that forest management provides all sorts of benefits that go beyond the borders of the private land or industrial land. And we know this can work. We know that people-centered forestry can work. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Menominee tribe and their environmental history and their thoughts about forest management. And I was fortunate enough to work with the College of Potawatomi Nation for about 8 years, living up there and learning from them on how they've managed forestry. So hopefully this isn't a story that you've heard of before, and it's a new one. This is a map that the Menominee tribe created of their forest, or excuse me, of their traditional lands. This is Lake Michigan here. This is the Bay of Green Bay. Here's Lake Superior. You can see the lacrosse stick right there. This is the Menominee traditional territory. And it's amazing, you look at it today, here we go, Menominee, keep this shape in mind. It's about 235,000 acres and most of it's forested. But from 1854 and 1856, when the reservation was established through treaty, they've been harvesting timber. They've been cutting timber, milling it into lumber. They've been using that from that time until today. When you look at it and you talk to the Menominee foresters, they tell you that they've harvested an equivalent of volume as if they just went out and liquidated all the trees 2.5 times. And today they have more volume, higher quality trees than when they started. That's truly amazing. Do you remember that cutout of the Menominee Reservation? Here's Google Earth. You can see it from the satellite. That's amazing. That's sustainable forestry. They've been doing that since the 1850s. And how have they done this? So many Menominee credit the roots of their forest management to one of the chiefs that they had during the treaty era, Chief Oshkosh. And Chief Oshkosh talked about starting at one end of the reservation and cutting through and going to the other reservation, taking the sick trees, the down trees, the dying trees, the mature trees, and then turning and going back and doing that forever. For Chief Oshkosh and the Menominee people, maintaining the forest, having the trees last forever means the people last forever. The people and the community and the forest are connected. They are together. The health of the community is the health of the forest. Now, don't try to read this. I like it because it looks old. So one of our first laws in the United States, federal laws that limits timber harvesting, happens for the Menominee Reservation in 1890. And in 1890, the law says that on the reservation, they can harvest but not exceed 20 million board feet per year. So we were calculating before what that is, because I don't think in board feet, but that's equivalent apparently for 1,300 framed houses or 4,000 logging trucks per year. 1890, that's before the Forest Service. That's the height of volume coming out of the lake states in the Great Cutover. 1890. That's the peak volume is 1889. And here we have a federal law that says Menominee has to limit their harvest to 20 million board feet per year, which, by the way, is what they're still harvesting today, more or less. How does that work? For the federal government, this was great. Federal Indian policy at the time was to convert Indians into farmers. And so for the federal government, this was going to be good because it was going to slowly convert Menominee Forest to farmland, 20 million board feet at a time. For the Menominee, it was great too. They said, oh, we can do what Chief Oshkosh was saying. We can maintain our forest forever. If we limit our harvest to this, we can do this and it will last forever, meaning that our people will be healthy like the forest. Continuing on with the Menominee history, these were some of the leaders, fighting for the sustainable forest management on the reservation. Continuing on, we have Senator Bob LaFollette, who was one of the progressive era senators of Wisconsin. And he worked with the tribe and got a law passed in 1906 that reiterated Menominee has to cap it at 20 million board feet. Their timber harvest can't exceed that, but also that Menominee was going to get a sawmill, the means to operate that sawmill, and education around it. So again, the federal government was trying to turn Indians, the policy is to turn Indians into yeoman Jeffersonian farmers. But here we have Menominee vision enacted through Senator LaFollette to become foresters. So Menominee were going to be foresters, not farmers. And for the Menominee, that was a good thing. They wanted that. Here's the sawmill that was built off that act. This is about 1910, the year that the sawmill was built. And today, there's still a sawmill at the same spot. This is community-centered forestry. This is providing jobs and economics for the resource, for the people, for the forest. Not to leave people with the impression that Menominee only do selection harvest, but they base their harvest on the diversity of the forest and the species and what they need. So here's a picture of a really, really amazing restoration that they did of some pine barren ecosystem. So this is real sandy fire. Menominee people were burning this area for many, many generations. And it's a picture of the restoration of this area. Now, this isn't always without controversy, but Menominee people, one of my friends and colleagues told me that if she would be worried if there wasn't controversy, because it would mean people didn't care about the forest. So having discussions, having controversies around what are our goals for management, where do we do this, why do we do this, how much do we do, those are important discussions we need to come together. But something that separates, I think, Menominee from other sectors of society, they don't argue about if cutting a tree is bad. I think people universally agree that harvesting timber, having that sawmill is important for the community and important for the forest. So from the time of the treaties until today, Menominee have been harvesting the forest. We know that this community-centered, people-centered forestry can work. We have an example, and there are more out there. There are more out there. When you ask Menominee people what forestry means to them, here are some examples of what they say. They say forestry is about sovereignty and protecting the forest, that forestry allows us to rally for that sovereignty, the right to manage their land and protect the forest. Sovereignty, told by my friend Melissa Cook, who was the director of the Sustainable Development Institute. Sovereignty is there and you can see it. The forest itself is the evidence of that. She's talking about that Google Earth image. You look at that forest, that's the sovereignty. That's protecting the forest. The evidence is there. You don't need a lot more than that. Menominee people, like an artist friend of mine, Dale Kakak, told me about jobs and income. He said, good forest management to me as a Menominee means that we have employment in the sawmill, that the forest is producing enough to have jobs, keep people employed, but it's not stressing the forest. The Menominee tell you that the forest dictates what the mill does. The mill doesn't dictate what the forest does. A couple other things that Menominee talk about with forest management. What does forest management mean? It means community well-being. One of the tribal legislators, leaders, former tribal chairperson John Teller, cultural leader, said that there's an old saying that the logging is the backbone of the Menominee tribe. It created jobs, which resulted in people being able to take care of their families. Dave Greeno, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the tribe, says that we had money that we were making off the forest. We provided for ourselves. We built a hospital. We paid the education of our children. This is community-centered forestry, forestry in benefit to the community. And finally, forestry means that we're providing and protecting the forest for future generations. And I think these are common sayings that you hear from many tribal people and many people that care about sustainability deeply, as we've heard people today talking about education of our children and leaving forests for our future. So we know it can work. The Menominee have shown us. There are other examples as well. To do this, we need to work with each other, bring our diverse perspectives together, and talk about things. And really what we're talking about is restoring our connections to the environment, restoring our part and our role, our responsibility within the forest ecosystem. We need to restore our connections with each other, like we're doing today, and restore our connections with the environment. Now, there's a lot of detractors on things like this, right? How do we put people at the center of our forestry? There's a lot of detractors. It takes a lot of work. It's not an easy thing. It takes time. It takes money. We don't know all the science. There's always going to be science we don't know, particularly as climate is changing and we're having our ecosystem shift. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't have all the answers from the scientific realm. There's also a cynicism in our society that we can't change things. These problems, these integrated social, ecological, economic problems are just so massive we can't do it. There's a lot of cynicism out there today. But we can take these disadvantages by changing our values and how we think about forestry and really using the power of forestry to solve our problems. And what happens when we do this? What happens when we put people at the center of forestry, community forestry? We start solving these problems. We have diverse, healthy forests. We have climate change mitigation. We're sequestering carbon. We're sequestering carbon both in the forest itself and in our forest products. We're dealing with energy issues. We're lowering our energy usage. We're learning to live and work with fire by putting people at the center of forestry. We're dealing with invasive species and all the cultural implications that they imply. We're solving our social problems. We're collaborating. We're learning from one another. We're having discussions. We're starting to view problems as integrated and find solutions that are also integrated. And I will say this, the skills that we learn by collaborating around forest management will be able to branch out and translate into skills that we can use to solve some of the most pressing social and economic issues of our day: inequality, lack of diversity, racism. All of these things, if we learn to respect and understand each other, can flow from a collaborative, people-centered forestry. A people-centered forestry can help us solve our economics problems as well. We need a vibrant forest products industry in order to be doing work out in the woods. And another thing with people-centered forestry and thinking about the future is that we'll have new innovations. And this came up in the intro. So here's a scientific journal showing nanomaterials made from wood. And these things are starting to be researched and studied. Essentially, all of these products that we make out of petroleum, we can make out of trees, right? Things like flexible computer chips, cell phones that can be recycled like newspapers, solar panels that we can paint on any flat surface, all made out of wood, all made out of a renewable resource. Wooden skyscrapers. There's beautiful in the museum and here, beautiful glulam timber framing. These are new technologies. We're starting to build skyscrapers with wood. These are social and ecological issues that we'll be starting to solve with new technology and new innovation. And in essence, we'll be starting to take more holistic approaches to all of our problems, our integrated problems, if we start putting people at the center of forestry or recognize that that's important. So, to summarize my points today, community forestry, I truly believe, has the potential to transform our society in the 21st century. We know it can work. We have the example from the Menominee that in the 1800s they were managing their forest, keeping people at the center of it, and it's worked, and we can have that work too. We need a diversity of perspectives in the discussion to get to the goals and outcomes of our forest management, but also this diversity of perspectives helps us in the research realm. We can ask better questions. We can get data and interpret that data in a different way. We can have different answers. So diversity not only helps us with our management, but it helps us do the science as well. And I think the tribal experiences have a huge role to play in this, getting us to a community, holistic understanding of forestry to adapt to our pressing problems like climate change. And here I'll go back. So this is a map that shows what the Midwest, what the lake states might look like under some of the climate projections in the summer. What do we have? This is today. This is in 2095. And what do we have? We have the states moving down to Oklahoma and Kansas, right? We have this experience. We've lived through that. But we won't get those values into the discussion if people aren't at the table. If we don't have the Indian people at the table that have this discussion, have this experience, have this understanding of not only dealing with this climate change, but living through and coming out thriving at this point, we're not going to come to the solutions that we need. And none of us can do it alone. Because when you look back at the map on the landscape, it's all interrelated. These landscapes are complex. And if we're not talking together, we can't just deal with Forest Service land here and tribal land here, and here's some private land, and here's a little suburb. No, we have to deal with these things together. So I call you all to act. We're taking that first step like we heard in the first talk today, to come together and recognize that foresters have tools. We as foresters have tools that can achieve many different goals and objectives. So I urge you to enlist the experience and the thoughts of foresters, both at your home, in your community, and at the national level. Get involved in these discussions. Take where we have today as a starting point and let's move forward. Listen to your neighbors. Engage with the tribes. Understand where different people are coming from. And let's build a better world together through forestry in the 21st century. Thank you.